Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back, and today we have hit episode number 40. 40 weeks, John and I have been doing this. We've actually been doing it longer, but we've only actually podcasted 40 of I think the 42 or 43 weeks that it's been around. Here we are, episode number 40, talking about our 61st favorite movies of all time tonight, although we're actually talking about John's 61st and 62nd. Guys, we're talking about Spotlight and It's a Wonderful Life, and It's a Wonderful Life. John had actually as his movie from last week. We moved it around, watched Kiss Kiss Bang Bang instead. It's a Wonderful Life will certainly be the second movie tonight. So if you're tuning in for that, skip forward to about the half-hour mark, because before that, all we're going to talk about is Mark Ruffalo eating hot dogs, because, oh boy, is that a characterization. I got something for everybody, and I just want it to be known. I'm going to do this to you, John. It's time, but I can't stop noticing how awful Mark Ruffalo is in Spotlight since you mentioned it. I literally ran a marathon after that. I was so excited to hear those words. John, what does it take away from the movie for you or no? And why in the world was he getting so much Oscar credit for this movie?
It's a really interesting question because watching it, Mark Ruffalo's performance in this is really bad. It like you said many times, it feels so dialed in. It's just so over the top. It's just him trying to seem to be working for an Oscar, and it's really confusing. But in the long run, it doesn't take too much out of this movie for me, because while I was rewatching it, I really noticed that the thing that's different about Spotlight from most of the other movies in my top 100 is it is a strictly plot-driven film. A lot of our a lot of our other films are very character-driven, and they have all this like artistic camera work and things like that. But Spotlight doesn't have. There's not many very spectacular shots in Spotlight, and the characters are really pushed to the side to focus on the story that's being told instead.
Yes, and so that was actually a knock that I had on this movie. So I don't know if you've ever seen All the President's Men. I think All the President's Men is like a damn near perfect movie. I think it's phenomenal, and it's very similar to this. This is essentially our generation's All the President's Men. It's very much we're going to figure out this story. We're going to work our way through it, all of that. I am so big with character, and in this movie, we get so little. Like, I guess my biggest problem is this. Granted, this is the story they're telling, so I can't really argue. Like this is a moot point, but this is why this movie doesn't do it for me. This isn't why this movie is bad or anything like that. This is just why this movie doesn't do it for me. Because they take a subject that everybody already knew everything about in 2015. This was not shocking news in 2015 that the Catholic Church was having these issues. This was not a surprise to anybody who walked in and sat down and watched the movie Spotlight. Okay, so there's that. So you already know what's going to happen. Your bad guys are the worst people you can be. They're pedophiles who prey on little boys and little girls. We already have that. This movie doesn't do anything for me to establish things beyond that. You take your bad guy and you keep them the bad guy. You take your good guys and you don't develop them worth crap, but we want to see them succeed because the bad guys are so bad. It's that whole thing of, you know what? Let's make an action movie. The Nazis are the bad guys. Now you got to root for our heroes. That's how this feels to me. I get that this movie is meant to be about the uncovering of all of this. And I actually think the pacing in this movie for what this movie is pretty much phenomenal until about the last half hour of the movie. And then I think it gets lost a little bit. But I think the pacing through the first hour of this movie is just boom, 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 boom. We're ripping through. But how many times can you sit down and watch people say, hey, it goes all the way to the top. Dun, 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 dun. And then they go and then they sit down with another person and say, hey, it goes all the way to the top. And then they cut to Mark Ruffalo and he's like, hey, I like hot dogs. And you're like, great, moving on. But this is what happens. And to me, it just, there's a lot of repetition, which it makes sense, but there's a lot of repetition. And the whole time you know what's coming. It's why I don't like Marvel movies. It's why I very rarely will watch TV shows that aren't on HBO or Lost. Because when you know what's going to happen, that's not good to me. Like, to me, I lose interest. I have too much like ADHD or something to sit down and just be like, oh, I'm going to watch a story play out that I know exactly how it's going to unfold and not be surprised. And I wasn't surprised during Spotlight. Now, that's ripping this, but I will say that this was a much better watch for me than the first time. Granted, it only moved up to 2.5 stars, but I swear that Mark Ruffalo knocks 1 full star off this movie for me. That's how grating and irritating I find him to be. I knocked this movie a full star for him. So if he wasn't in this movie, they had somebody who could actually like not hunch their shoulders and be like, hello, I'm acting. How are you? I'm an actor. This movie could very easily be in a 3.5 star movie, but he really screws this one up for me so bad.
You give me a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
So let's try.
That was like a 3.5 minute rant. That was
I know. So let's try working it backwards here. In regards to the idea that everyone knew this was a thing, I agree. As people who were born in the early 90s, like you and I were, it kind of seemed like this idea that this abuse in the church that is always happening and was always known just kind of seemed ever present in our lives. It seemed like a thing that just was like this global knowledge. But the thing that really got me about Spotlight the first time I watched it was realizing that it was 2001.
Yeah.
That the actual scale of how bad this was made public and wasn't being obscured anymore because this team had investigated into it. And that really hit. And of course, like there's a lot of other things because being Canadian, a large part of Canada's history and like one of the biggest like shames of Canada are the residential schools that the Indigenous peoples were put in that were run by the Catholic Church, where a lot of this abuse was happening all the time. So like that, it's so relevant to all of my life just because it's so present in my life. And that's what I really appreciate about this movie is that it really does a good job of showing the scope of everything. Yes, it starts small, and yes, there's a lot of repeating actions, but that's how investigations work. And when it starts small, and then every time they kind of get to that next bubble of the amount of people who are involved in this, it escalates, and they have to do all the research again, and they have to start at the basics again. And I really enjoy the way that it's showing that investigation throughout the film. Yeah. Mark Ruffalo, for some reason, is like hunchback the entire film for no reason. Maybe there's a reason.
I get that he's probably imitating the real Mike in real life, but that real Mike guy seems like somebody I would never want to encounter. So why? And no, Jordan, I said All the President's Men is a near perfect movie.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like, this isn't coming across in film. Why didn't someone tell him that? Because it did get distracting at one point. I think it was when they're in the basement and they're going through all of the books and like looking up all the assignments and everything. At that point, that was the point where I really noticed it. And it's like, Mark Ruffalo, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? It just looks like you're being lazy.
Well, and everybody else is so subdued in this movie. And that was the part, that's really the big part for me. Because before that, I'm like, okay, he's annoying, whatever. But the part where they're looking through the archdiocese books or whatever it is for every year and who was at each parish and all of that, that was the part where I'm like, why is he like, oh, is that a book? Oh, it says their name in the book. Go away. Like, it's like, why are we doing a cartoon performance? And like, I think at this time, Mark Ruffalo was just hot. People really liked Mark Ruffalo. He's coming off the Hulk, and there'd been so many shitty Hulks before this that now he's the Hulk. Everybody loves him in that. You know, he hadn't really gotten his credit, but he was coming off of, and I believe that I'm getting the order right on this. And I could be getting it wrong, but he was coming off of the wrestling movie that Bennett Miller made. What is the name of that movie? Foxcatcher, which I believe came out in 2014, which it did. So he's coming off of that, which he was just hot. And I think people just got blinded by it. This was also a year where, in terms of supporting actors, we had seen a big shift to where this was more of a female-driven year. We had Mad Max, Fury Road, Brooklyn, Room, all of a sudden we're paying a little bit more attention to the female roles and the man roles. We had the Danish girl, we had the Hateful Eight, Steve Jobs, all these things. And the men nominated that year were Tom Hardy in The Revenant, who I think should have won. I don't think it was really in question. I think he is hands down the best part of The Revenant. I think he's phenomenal.
Yeah.
I think he should have won. Sylvester Stallone in Creed, which was totally just because he was reprising Rocky Balboa, even though he's very good in it. Christian Bale in The Big Short because they wanted to nominate Christian Bale. Mark Rylance, who ends up winning for Bridge of Spies. And then we get to Mark Ruffalo in Spotlight. It was just like, why did they land on Mark Ruffalo? I really believe that it's because in Foxcatcher, he should have won the Oscar and he didn't. And I think that they were, and I forget who he actually lost to. Maybe he shouldn't have won, but he was phenomenal in Foxcatcher. And so I think they landed on him, and I really thought he was going to win it the entire time. And I would honestly say that Rami Malek's performance in Bohemian Rhapsody is probably the worst acting performance I've seen win a best whatever out of any of them. Plenty of bad ones that I just haven't seen, but that's the worst one I've seen. This would have been the worst one. And again, it's just to me because I think Stanley Tucci is the best part of this movie. I think he is absolutely. Oh, and never mind. Jordan Oliver said he lost to J.K. Simmons. So yeah, no, J.K. Simmons gives arguably one of the top 5 performances of all time in Whiplash. So that's fine. But I find Stanley Tucci to be the best part of this movie. However, every single scene Stanley Tucci's in is with Mark Ruffalo, and it kills me.
Yeah, and that bringing up Stanley Tucci is one of the things that's also really good about this film because, like you said, there are a lot of subdued performances in this film, and it's a lot of these smaller roles which are much better. Because we're talking about Stanley Tucci's performance, which is just so emotional because he's sitting there and he's just trying to help these people, and you see that like the battle, the scene where he's talking to Mark Ruffalo. And he's going in to talk to the family where the 2 children have been assaulted. It like you see the duty in Stanley Tucci's character, but also this like he's so weathered and worn down because he's had to do this so many times, and that's why he's helping with the investigation in the first place. And then you have Lee Schreiber is incredible in this film for the small role that he has. And just being that inciting incident and the character that's inciting the entire investigation in the first place by saying, no, this is what we need to talk about. And his dedication to that is huge. And then even like Michael Keaton, who's leading this, and when it finally comes out that he is the one who kind of buried this before, and like he could have been the person to have brought this to light 6 years earlier, like you can see the pain that these actors are having. And then you have Mark Ruffalo, who he has that, and his pained face in this movie is so weird.
Stop eating cheese so you can take a dump, dude. Like that's what it looks like. And that's what bothers me because okay, so this is an ensemble piece. And Stanley Tucci and Liev Schreiber, and it's really Stanley Tucci. Like, let's just be real. Stanley Tucci is the only character who is multidimensional in this movie. And I really believe that. Stanley Tucci, his character, he's this crazy guy. He's like a lawyer. Oh, he's a character. You're not going to get along with him, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that it's because he's doing it for all the right reasons.
Yeah.
So that's what we're seeing from Stanley Tucci here. Liev Schreiber, we're starting to get there. It's a Jewish editor coming in. He's got to deal with the Catholic Church. It's not going to be easy for him, and he's trying to change things up. You have Michael Keaton, who's dealing a little bit with this struggle of he knows he's the one who pushed it under the rug, and now he's doing it, but we don't realize that till the end. James DRC or Brian James DRC, whatever his name is, he at least has the family element. Rachel McAdams and Mark Ruffalo, who got all the credit for this movie, the 2 of them got the Oscar nominations. There's nothing interesting about their characters to me. And that's what hurts this so much for me. Their characters have no family life. And Mark Ruffalo, he's got the girl, but he doesn't live with her because he's in this and he's just married to the job. Cool. Seen it before. Like, interestingly done. Then we have Rachel McAdams, who's living with her grandma or doing stuff with her grandmother, and her husband's barely in it. I'm fine with that. But, like, it's still not interesting. Like, they're just 2 halves of the same coin. Yes, I understand that that's how it happened in real life and whatever, and that's fine. but also sometimes you have to take creative liberties and make things more interesting. And that's like next week, we're going to talk about The Impossible. People got so mad at that movie because it wasn't the exact Spanish family it was supposed to be, and they casted British white people and blah, blah, blah. But the movie is still a great movie. Like, it is still a great story. I think that this is a great story that is just missing key elements to make this a great movie. And I think that's where it drops for me. I'm honestly shocked how much the regular viewing public loves this movie. I am in the minority. You are in the vast majority, which surprises me because this is not the type of movie I think normally that a regular movie. I mean, this is in the IMDb top 250. Letterboxd has like a 4.1 or 4.2, something like that. It wins the Oscar. This is coming on the heels, or this is comes out right before Moonlight, which the general viewing public despises Moonlight. People think that movie's boring, pretentious garbage that should have never won Best Picture. I'm talking about general viewing public. I'm not talking about like that movie doesn't get the same reviews, but Spotlight caught on. Is it because it's going at the Catholic Church and people like that? I can't get it, but you have it at number 61. So
I do.
What is it?
I do. And I will take this time to admit, Spotlight benefited from being the movie I watched right before making my top 100.
Okay.
If I was revisiting it, it would be in the 90s, not in the 60s.
Gotcha.
But a lot of it came from the fact that
all my good movies.
But a lot of it came from the fact that I had watched it recently, and when I was making my top 100, I was like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I like that movie more than this movie. And then having rewatched those movies now, I can tell you that I didn't like it more than some movies that are below it in my top 100. But I do still enjoy it, and I do really like the plot-driven aspect of it, because I just think the fact that this is so widely praised, like you said, is weird. It's even weird. It's weirder when you consider the subject content of this film. This isn't a film that should be popular.
Oh, not at all.
This is a film that should have been essentially pushed under the rug, like by the powers that be, because that's what this film is about. It is about the abuse of institutional powers. Because in the end, it is about how not even just the fact that there is this scandal happening in the Catholic Church where priests are sexually assaulting children. It's the fact that it goes all the way to the top, and they've been hiding it this entire time. That is the systemic abuse. And it's even reflected in the Boston Globe room itself, where there is this systemic abuse, where they're afraid of the lash or the backlash they'll receive for publishing such an article, saying such a thing, especially in Boston, one of the most Catholic cities in America.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think it's important that it's set in Boston too.
Absolutely.
I think that really elevates, that definitely elevates things.
Absolutely. Because of how prevalent the Catholic religion is in Boston culture. Like you said, there were 1,500 churches, Catholic churches in Boston. That is a crazy number of churches.
That's ridiculous. Yeah.
And it's like Joel Nerolf was saying here, right? It's a movie about great journalism in an era of unreliable journalism. Right?
That's why critics loved it. Critics are also journalists. It is funny.
Yeah. Right? It's because we were at that point where journalism's taken a turn around 2005. This is leading up right to the Trump election. This is where we had that great schism in journalism, where we really had the right versus the left.
Okay. Yeah. You mean 2015?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, you said 2005, and I was like,
I meant 2015.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, and that wasn't like I don't want to just like correct. I was just like, wait a second, I'm in a different world here. Where did John?
2015. That was that schism, right? So, yeah, seeing journalism, seeing people actually looking at something objectively rather than subjectively, despite the fact that it was going against the way they were raised, despite the fact that it was literally going against everything they knew. And that they had their worlds shattering around them, and they knew they couldn't sit on it. And that's really what I think pulls people in, because Spotlight has this ability in it where it kind of makes you feel like there is an opportunity to make a difference.
Mhm.
Because that's something
Well,
that we never feel. We always feel we're one person. What can we do? And then we see this team of 4 investigative reporters digging into this and bringing it to light and having this massive effect.
well, and I think that's, you bring up a good point with the timing because we are so blatantly in this era of if you talk to a left-wing person, they tell you Fox News isn't real. If you
Mhm,
talk to a right-wing person, they tell you CNN and MSNBC aren't real.
mhm.
We have shift like this movie is very much about people just wanting to tell the story the right way, wanting to do the right thing to save the right people. That is what this movie is about. There was no agenda to this. This agenda, and I think that's what comes across actually very well in this movie.
Mhm.
The agenda of this movie wasn't to take down the Catholic Church because that wasn't the agenda of Spotlight.
Yep.
They just wanted to look into it and see why were they covering up for this person.
Mhm.
But the agenda isn't let's take down the Catholic Church. Journalists weren't supposed to go into stories with an agenda already. They're not documentary filmmakers. They are supposed to be going in and they are supposed to be going in neutral and figure out how you want to go through this. That does not happen at all nowadays. It just doesn't. If you, depending on what your byline is and what publication you're writing for, you are going into whatever story being told, spin it this way and make this person look like shit. That wasn't the case here. They just wanted to get one guy. And then Liev Schreiber says, let's get the whole system. But they build to that point because they
Yeah.
see what's happening. They see that it's actually a process and it's a problem. And it's something that's been going on and on and on and on, which nowadays just doesn't happen. Nowadays, it's just, I don't care where you get your news from. You're probably getting 50% right and 50% bullshit because that is just how it goes. They're trying to make you feel a certain way. And in this movie, we see a very religious grandmother sitting down and reading the article that her granddaughter wrote, and the granddaughter like sitting with her and kind of like working through it with her because she knows how much the religion means to her. But we also see Rachel McAdams going through the struggle of like why I don't go to church anymore, even though I grew up this way, because it's just too much for me.
Mhm.
We know that about this character. We know that about this person. Nowadays, we don't know who's giving us our news. We don't know, like, okay, like, have they always just been that bitter towards whoever they're writing this about? We don't know, but we just take whatever they're saying at face value. And Jordan brings up the thing with that's why critics loved it. Critics are also journalists. I also can't name more than 3 critics anymore because none of them have credibility anymore. They just throw their name out there so they can get in the aggregate with Rotten Tomatoes. And then we say, oh, great, critics loved it. The critic is us. Like, why can't we be on Rotten Tomatoes? We should be on Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, that's how stupid we have gotten with our journalism and with our critiques and all of that. It's just gotten ridiculous, but it still blows my mind. Spotlight has an 8.1 on IMDb. Moonlight has a 7.4. Moonlight has a 7.4. What is so much more compelling about this? I really do think that a lot of it is just the pushback from a lot of moviegoers towards the Catholic Church. If you went to see this movie, you're probably not a very, very excited Catholic. Like, let's just be real. My parents saw it and loved this movie. They're Catholic, but they aren't like Catholic.
Yeah.
And I think that the people who are very Catholic didn't go see this movie. And a lot of people who did watch this were like, it's almost like an FU to the church. And that's why I think this one is better appreciated than something like Moonlight, which if you really think about those two movies, they're kind of similar in their like style. The fact that they're an indie movie, low budget, just get great actors doing great things, and that's what happens.
Yeah, and speaking of great actors, because there is one performance that we haven't mentioned, and that's Billy Crudup's performance.
Yeah.
And I think Billy Crudup comes off as such a sleazy lawyer until that scene where he finally breaks and he says, I gave you a list of names, 20 names, and you ignored it. And like, we're talking about how these characters don't really feel developed and they don't really have a lot of depth to them. That was a moment of depth in a character in this film. And it was phenomenal because you could just see the frustration because he has been playing the system and he's been doing all that he can based on how everyone else is reacting to the situation.
Yeah. Another one we didn't mention is John Slattery, and he doesn't do anything particularly special in this movie, but Roger Sterling is like the greatest character of all time. So for anybody who hasn't watched Mad Men, every time I see John Slattery, I'm just like, oh, it's Roger Sterling.
Yeah.
So yeah, that gets me pumped every single time. So I go with that. But anyway, neither really here nor there. But I do agree with you that Billy Crudup is a super underrated actor. He's very good in like every single thing he does.
So okay, we're going to talk about him a lot more eventually.
What do you have him in?
We both have Almost Famous.
Oh yeah. In Almost Famous, he is fantastic in Almost
Yeah.
Famous. So yeah, it's a good point. I totally forgot that we were going to be talking about Almost Famous at a later time. But yeah, I mean, so again, like Spotlight, I have this as a 2.5-star movie. I wanted to make it higher. I really did. I went into this pretty open-minded. The first hour, I'm like, ooh, it's whipping, it's whatever. Mark Ruffalo's annoying, but whatever. And once I start getting into the reveals and stuff, I just can't get over that hump. I just cannot get over that hump.
I find with pacing, I think one of the big things with pacing is the movie really slows down once 9/11 happens.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think that's intentional.
I think it's intentional because the story starts to slow down, like in real life, but it doesn't
translate to film well.
It doesn't translate to film well, and I think that's the biggest problem. Like, if you're gonna have somebody be bored and be stumbling around and whatever, because we see this a lot in like film noirs and stuff like that. There still has to be that calm before the storm. Ultimately, what happens is 9/11 happens. It gets pushed back for 4 months, which is actually 6 minutes of the movie. And then it just gets right back to where it was. And it's like, well, who even cares that 9/11 happened? Like, in this movie, it seems irrelevant, even though it is actually massively
incredibly
relevant to why it's being pushed. It just feels irrelevant. And I think that that's where, the problem kind of comes with this.
Definitely. And I mean, the other thing I will critique on this movie, I really don't like Howard Shore's score for this film.
I'm hit or miss with it. Because I understand what it's going for. It's like a mature kind of thing, I guess, is what it's going for. But I am inclined to agree that I don't sit here and be like, wow, like now we're talking when it comes to score. And I mean, this was a year with some really good scores. This is the one where Ennio Morricone finally won. For a Best Picture winner to not even be nominated for Best Score is pretty rare.
Especially with Howard Shore as the composer. Like,
this is
the guy who wrote the Lord of the Rings music, right? And this score is just so busy all the time. And it's just a little distracting sometimes from what's going on.
I agree. And McCarthy doesn't end up winning Best Director. It goes to Iñárritu, which I agree with. Although actually I think George Miller probably should have won Best Director this year, even though I'm we all know I have The Revenant in my top 100. George Miller's direction in Mad Max Fury Road is pretty unbelievable. But again, this is where I come in. When you look at the movies that were nominated for Best Picture this year, Bridge of Spies is pretty good. It's a Spielberg movie, but it's pretty good. It's not war horse bullshit. It's pretty good. Mad Max Fury Road is phenomenal. Room is phenomenal. Brooklyn, I think, is one of the most underrated movies, perhaps in the history of cinema. I know it gets nominated for Best Picture, but it still was like definitely like congrats, you got nominated for Best Picture. I think Brooklyn is a phenomenal movie, and if I rewatch that might crack my top 100 because the first time I watched it, that movie was amazing, and it was just one of those things you didn't really admit to your friends that you loved Brooklyn that much. I think The Big Short's a little overrated. I think it's got a shtick. I think The Martian's a little bit overrated. But at the end of the day, when I go through the 8 Best Picture winners, Spotlight's my number 8 every single time. Every time. Like, I don't even think it's really close. Like, I think every other movie that year is a 3-star movie that was nominated. If Carol was nominated, I would put Spotlight over Carol. I think Carol is very, very boring. But then I would put Spotlight over Carol. Unfortunately for you, John, it wasn't nominated, and therefore it goes down at the very bottom. And I just think it's surprising that this is the one that won. I think Room is a more compelling. I personally think Room is a more compelling story because it's one where you don't really know what's going to happen, and it's something that we don't really know. And Jordan, you just wait 3 seconds, man. You just wait 3 seconds for my Saoirse Ronan take, okay? But anyway, I just think like Room is a more compelling, indie movie. Brooklyn never had a chance. But like then when you start looking at the bigger movies like The Revenant, Mad Max, Bridge of Spies, how does Spotlight pull this out? I don't know, but it did. And people like you just keep on telling me it's really great.
I enjoy it. It's one of the few movies where I feel like I can simultaneously like turn my brain off and just focus completely on it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things. The first time I watched Spotlight, I had to go somewhere with like half an hour left in the movie. I was like, okay, I can finish it later. And I just decided to watch it as I was going there.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I hopped on the bus and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna finish watching this movie because I was so enthralled with it. And that's just how I felt about the film and how engaged I got into it.
Mm-hmm. No, and I mean, hey, sometimes that happens.
Mhm.
Sometimes you're me and that doesn't happen at all.
Yeah.
And that, for me, Spotlight, if I missed the last half hour, I still would have done this podcast and never let you know. All right. Let's move on. John, what was the best movie you watched this week? I actually had a somewhat busy week for the first time in a while. I think I had 6 movies, 7 movies.
I had a really tame week. I only had 3 movies this week.
Wow. Okay.
So,
what you got?
Up until yesterday, my best movie was High Life.
Okay.
Which is a phenomenally underrated film. But it changed today because I watched The Squid and the Whale for the first time today.
It's a great movie.
And that movie is absolutely phenomenal. The performance from the young Jesse Eisenberg in it is great. Jeff Daniels is incredible. And it's just so... It's just such a raw, emotional film.
Yeah, Squid and the Whale is great. Squid and the Whale, I think, is probably my second favorite Noah Baumbach because of Kicking and Screaming. And Kicking and Screaming is such a small, movie. And it's low budget. It's just talking. It's not a well filmed movie, but it is just a masterpiece in every way. But Squid and the Whale is probably my number 2 from him. It's a great one. Poor Jordan Alford has not seen Almost Famous, which just blew my mind. So we can just kind of ignore him for the rest of this podcast. So I finally got around to seeing some of the newer ones that I've been wanting to see. I saw Dune, thought it was really, really good. My biggest knock with it is that I haven't read the source material. I haven't seen the David Lynch movie. The first 20 minutes, I was like, what the fuck is going on? And that's okay because it's sci-fi and that's great and whatever. But it really took me a little bit to get going. And then it got going. I thought it was a beautiful movie. I thought the production was absolutely incredible. I loved so much about it. And then I thought at the end, it just kind of ended. It didn't have I know it's going to be a trilogy and all of that, but like Fellowship of the Ring very much ends with like, that's the end of the Fellowship. And now we begin our next story. Yeah. Star Wars, we talked about A New Hope. Like that was never meant to be a whatever, like a trilogy. At least it didn't seem like it. And so it kind of ends. This didn't really feel like it had an ending. So I give that one 3.5 stars. Saw The French Dispatch. I'd give it 3. So I'd actually put Dune above The French Dispatch. French Dispatch, man, it's Wes being Wes, and he's leaning in hard. I think The Last Story is the best story, and Saoirse Ronan, as we were just talking about with her in Brooklyn, and then in this movie, she's playing like a big-haired like hooker or whatever she is. Like Saoirse Ronan is she's my favorite actress, like by far. It's not even close. I love Saoirse Ronan. Should have been in the whole movie. If she was in the whole movie, French Dispatch is a 4-star movie. Weird though. Holy crap, was that movie weird.
Such a weird movie. And I
such a weird movie.
Every minute of it.
It's so weird. I know you were huge on it. You gave it 4.5. You're going to be looking at putting in the top 100. See, for me, it reminded me a lot of Life Aquatic, but I felt a little bit better than Life Aquatic because I don't really like Life Aquatic.
But I also like Life Aquatic.
I think that's the thing. But Jordan said it here. The Last Story in French Dispatch is amazing. I completely agree. I think the first story is a little too bizarre. I think and I'm talking about the main stories. I think the second story really picks up towards the end. And I think the third story, I think Jeffrey Wright is phenomenal. Ed Norton's little role is great. And Saoirse Ronan and it's perfect. Like I love that last one. And that's really what I got for that. So anyway, what was the best movie I watched this week? Hercules. It's the best. It's one of the best Disney movies. That's the one I got. I rewatched it for the first time in like a year and a half, or actually almost 2 years. That's the one, man. Every time I see that, it grows on me more and more. I was not a big Hercules fan when it first came out. And now I love it. I love that it has nothing to do with the real myth. I love that, like, the songs. I love that they went all in on the 80s style. It's the best one I watched this week. But best new movie, Dune. I think it was much better than French Dispatch. All right, Let's talk about It's a Wonderful Life, a movie that none of you have probably seen. John, you had it as your last week movie. I have it as my this week movie. I feel like this one, we're just pretty much both talking about it in the same spot here. Not really anything negative to say. We saw Jordan in here say earlier he can't believe that it was so low. We had Adam Jumbo make a quick appearance after, trying to, convince me that Survivor's good. He said the fact that Wonderful Life isn't in the top 10 means Phil list is complete sham. Well, John, yours is too.
I didn't see that.
Yes. Also, Adam's list is just not very good. I saw his. It's kind of a joke. But It's a Wonderful Life. Like, I don't really know what more you're supposed to say about this movie. So I pretty much planned an entire speech about Frank Capra. So I'll let you go ahead and kind of say what it is about It's a Wonderful Life that works for you. I'll talk about what it works for me. And then I just want to talk about Frank Capra because I think Frank Capra is sorely underappreciated by our generation because they really only know him for this movie.
Yeah, I mean, It's a Wonderful Life. It's just part of the cultural zeitgeist at this point. And a lot of that comes down to the clerical error that made it so that all of a sudden networks could just air it.
Yeah.
And what a great clerical error that was. That this is one of those movies that is so present in our society that you literally can't go a week from as of the beginning of November where It's a Wonderful Life isn't playing on television. And it's just such an easily accessible film. And to have out a film of this quality that easily accessible to everyone is phenomenal. And the fact that it's like it's got that Christmas tag to it when it's not really a Christmas movie. The last act of it just happens to take place on Christmas Eve. But it's phenomenal. It's Jimmy Stewart in his second best performance, in my opinion.
Behind the Philadelphia Story, of course.
Yes, that's definitely the movie that I have in my top five.
See, that's where I go, but I know you're going to Vertigo. But go ahead, continue.
And even though we are somehow supposed to believe that Jimmy Stewart is playing a 21-year-old in this movie at one point.
For some points, he's a teenager.
Yeah, we're supposed to believe that, but it's okay because his performance is phenomenal. And the character of George Bailey is honestly possibly one of the greatest heroes in any Hollywood film ever made.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And I don't even think that's close. So when AFI did their 100 Years, 100 Heroes, he was number 9. When they did their AFI top 10 of whatever, fantasy, this was number 3 on the all-time fantasy list. For 100 Years, 100 Passions, it was number 8. For 100 Years, 100 Laughs, it was it wasn't actually on that one because it's not very funny. 100 Years, 100 Cheers, number 1. 100 Years, 100 Movies, it's number 20. It just goes on and on and on and on. And it's because it's just become so iconic. Like, the thing with this movie is everybody knows everything about this movie. And what I find to be the most fascinating thing about It's a Wonderful Life is that if it was made today, it would be told in a completely different way because the part that everybody remembers from this movie, if you tell me what's the log line of this, it's about a man who finds out what life would have been like if he had never been born. Great. You just defined the last 30 minutes. Now tell me about the first hour and 40 minutes of this movie. Nobody ever talks about the first hour and 40 minutes of this movie because the first hour and 40 minutes, like everybody talks about the moments from it, but nobody actually puts that in when they're telling you what this movie is about. And so when you think about how movies get made nowadays, right away, we would see George Bailey trying to kill himself, which we don't see in this movie, but we hear it and all of that. But it would be like flashbacks from him. And they would start off with, oh, you never existed. Like maybe you'd get 20 minutes in the first act, but then it would be right away. The turning point in act 1 would be, you never existed. That would be it. And the next hour of the movie would be about that. But back in 1946, you could take your time and you could just tell the story and the world that is built with George Bailey and Bedford Falls and everything that he runs into, every single obstacle that he ends up confronting throughout his entire life as he just constantly puts other people first. That's why you end up crying at the end of this movie. Oh, yeah. If this movie was told in the new school Hollywood way, you wouldn't cry because it would be told in the wrong order. This movie needs to be told where you see every single thing that this guy has but in his one moment of weakness, he doesn't appreciate any of it. And now we watch what happens when it's all taken away from him. And I always think about the line of, he wasn't there to save them because you weren't there to save him.
Mhm.
And you think about those things all the time, like in life and everything that's going, because it's like, you don't even, there's certain things that you've done in your life that you never even thought about, where you said something to somebody and that person has, for some reason, remembered that line. There's things from people that I can't remember their names, but they said something and I'm like, that has stuck with me. That has defined something of me, whatever it is. This movie does that, but does it in such an exaggerated way of like going against Mr. Potter and doing all of that. And Mr. Potter, not for nothing, one of the greatest villains in film history. It just does so much. He's number 6 on the greatest movie villains of all time. It's such a ordinary man takes on the bad guy and lives this, people always say, oh, small town. I hate that I grew up there. I hate that I grew up in a small town. Like, it is what it is. But so much of that defines who you are. And it's always, how can I get out of here? What can I do? And the part where Donna Reed says, I want to live in that house. Why would you want to live here? I want to go see the world. I want to do this. You take for granted everything you have as you continue through. And I think that's why this is such a classic holiday movie, because it is that time when you really stop taking for granted all the stuff you take for granted pretty much 360 days of the year.
Yeah. I mean, despite the fact that I think this movie originally released in April, if I remember correctly. And there was no intention for this to be a Christmas movie or associated with Christmas at all.
Although at the beginning, it does have the storybook thing with the sleds and Christmas stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just because like the main story is technically the entire story takes place on Christmas, because everything before that's a flashback.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just comes down to the fact that George Bailey, even at his weakest moment, as he's contemplating suicide, it's for everyone else in his life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because he's downtrodden. It's not because he's put out. It's not because he's losing. It's because he knows that his life insurance policy will get everyone out of this bind that they're in.
Yep.
And that's just such a moving moment that I think is really overlooked by a lot of people when they first watch this film. And it's just such an important thing to connect with in this film. And to me, it's one of those reasons why George Bailey is this iconic hero. It's because even when he's seemingly doing something that is just the unimaginable, but he has to go there because he thinks it's the only way he can protect the people he cares about.
Yeah, because it comes across, on the eye, it comes across like, oh, he's going to go to jail and therefore he's got to do this. But in reality, it is that life insurance thing. And I mean, so this is what I was going to say with Frank Capra. So anybody who's not really familiar with the Frank Capra movies, some of them do feel very dated at this point. I mean, he was making movies in the 30s and the 40s. That was when he was in his prime. He did It Happened One Night, 1934, probably one of the most iconic classic Hollywood movies ever. Does it really stand the test of time? Some of it, most of it, but it's dated. He does You Can't Take It With You, wins Best Picture with that one. He does Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is an absolute classic. Doesn't win Best Picture with that one. Loses to Gone with the Wind. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is so much better. But The Wizard of Oz should have won Best Picture that year anyway, so I don't care. And then he comes out, and in 1944, he does Arsenic and Old Lace, which is a phenomenal Halloween movie. If you haven't seen that, it is a comedy, but it is set around Halloween, where it's got Cary Grant and probably his funniest performance ever, and that's saying a lot because Cary Grant's phenomenal. And then he does this in 1946. But the thing with Frank Capra, and I skipped Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and all. Like, I skipped so many of his great movies. But the thing with Frank Capra is it was always about the ordinary man and how you have to appreciate it and fighting against the power, which is funny because he ended up being a huge proponent and a massive director for these Why We Fight propaganda films. And so he was making those, but he was always about how can you as your individual self take down the system in whatever system that is. And it's, in this, Mr. Potter is played by Lionel Barrymore. in You Can't Take It With You, Lionel Barrymore is the free loving guy who heads the family and is saying, what does it matter? Who cares how much money you have? Like, we give, we do all this. And it's about good people being taken advantage of. And all of his movies are like that, but also those good people kind of knowing they're being taken advantage of, but doing it anyway because they care more about other people than they do themselves. Frank Capra's world is so unreal. But it gives you that hope that it could be real. And I think that's what's so amazing about It's a Wonderful Life. You think about like other classic Christmas movies, they always have Santa Claus in them or something, I mean, A Christmas Carol doesn't, but A Christmas Carol is also, based on the classic Charles Dickens. So that's going to have a difference there. That's a difference maker. And then you have, Miracle on 34th Street, Elf, whatever you want to do from the 30s all the way till now. But this one stands the test of time without really even mentioning Christmas. But you go back to it because it gives you that hope that there's so much good in humanity. And it's really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why you end up crying at the end of this movie, right? Like, well, because I can tell you, I certainly bawled yesterday when I finished watching this movie. And it was just because it's just so overwhelming just how impactful George Bailey is and how good he is. And despite the fact that Potter does an incredibly malicious act at the end of the movie that seems to drive our hero to the brink of suicide. And beyond that, like, the film is just all good. And that moment when the bank, what is that? What is his?
Building and loan.
No, the bank guy, the investigator from the bank.
Oh, yeah. I know
the moment he puts that bill in the basket, it's just like, this is the power of George Bailey and what the effect he has on this community. And this is just his genuine goodness coming through. And you're hard pressed to find a movie that is more intrinsically this idea of good versus evil and presenting it in a way where it feels so human.
Exactly. And we see him go through all these moments when, he's supposed to go on his honeymoon and he can't go on his honeymoon because he's doing whatever. And he can't go, to college because of this. And he's always putting everybody else first. And I think that's what works so well too, is it's the same characters who keep coming through every time. Bert and Ernie. You have his brother who's always coming back, Sam Wygard or whatever his last name is. It's always the same characters. Martini, Nick, I can't think of the guy's name who's the druggist. Like, you see all of this happening. And so at the end, for all of them to be there for him feels authentic, despite the fact that it also feels unbelievably unrealistic. But we see this all the time nowadays with like Kickstarters, or, we saw it like when Sunday passed with the Survivor player, for anybody who's not actually here because they're a Survivor fan. Like, we see these types of things coming out for families and things like that. It is real, it is a real thing that can happen. It just feels unrealistic because we live in more of a pessimistic society. But when you watch this movie, none of this feels forced. It feels like, why wouldn't they come to his side? And Sam Wygard saying, hey, we're going to wire you up $25,000. And he doesn't even need that, but we have the money. So why wouldn't we give that to you? Giving everything else to everybody else. It's saying to you that you can do what's right for everybody else and it will eventually come back. And it's that whole pay it forward thing. And you'll create a better society. And Potter is going to die alone. And it gets frustrating to fight with him all the time because, he just wants you, I have money and whatever. What do I need? You're not getting what you want either. But he's going to die alone. Everybody's going to forget about him. People aren't going to forget about George Bailey. And I think that's what's so amazing about this movie. And it's somebody that you hope you see in your life. It's somebody you hope you see in your community. It's somebody you hope you can be. And he doesn't have a superpower. He just literally does good things for people. It's very interesting.
Yeah. He's essentially this ideal person, right? It's this idea. And I mean, a lot of it comes down to like this idea. It is a bit of a propagandized character, but it's this ideal that this person's here and doing these selfless things because it's the right thing to do. And they're a righteous person. And that's why I think you were talking about the AFI top 100 or top 100 heroes list. The fact that he is that low on that list is baffling, especially when you consider the fact that the person at number 1 on that list is Atticus Finch, and George Bailey's a much bigger hero than Atticus Finch is.
The thing is, with To Kill a Mockingbird, that's a movie that does. It's a great movie, but it is just one of those movies that does not stand the test of time that AFI, the way AFI thought it was going to stand the test of time. Atticus Finch is great, but this kind of goes back to my whole thing with what we just talked about with Spotlight. Atticus Finch is great because he's going against racists. Of course he's going to be great. Now, it's one of the most complex characters we ever see in film, where he is, himself racist, but going out against the racist to protect this man because he was innocent. So we are seeing that and that complexity and all that, but he does not stand the test of time the way George Bailey does. No. Now, granted, when you can be a holiday movie, you also are going to be much more viewed.
Yes.
And that's the one thing It's a Wonderful Life really has going for it. George Bailey is without a doubt the number one hero in film history, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think they'd probably throw Luke Skywalker or Han Solo up there probably at this point ahead of him, just because those movies have caught on so much. But it should be George Bailey, because every single year everybody connects with that. And you don't have to be a sci-fi fan to love George Bailey. And, I don't want to watch a boring black and white movie. Great. Go watch the color version that's on Amazon, because it's, please please don't do that. Yeah, please don't. But it is there. And I think that that's just something to be said about, like, the effort they put in to keep this movie in the public eye and how well it's been kept in the public eye. And I don't see this movie ever falling off, because it's already lasted nearly, it's 75 years old right now. 75 years old. Not many movies that are 75 years old are still relevant right now. And this one is still watched every year, and it's being watched every year by people our age who are going to have kids, who are going to have their kids watch it every year. And their kids aren't going to look at that as me trying to sit them down and watch It Happened One Night.
Yeah.
Because It Happened One Night, they're going to say, that's boring. Why are you having me do this? But this is a movie where you're going to get that connection, that, it's Christmas time, it's whatever. That's what creates a classic. And yeah, George Bailey, number one. He's number one.
Yeah, and then there's the fact that not many people realize this is a fantasy movie either. And a lot of people talk about this movie because it is presented in such a way where it seems so reasonable. But that last 30 minutes, which is the part everyone talks about, and you don't have people being like, this is a crazy fantasy movie. Despite the fact that it is a fantasy movie, and the way Capra does capture that, I love the transition from it's snowing to not snowing, and then back to snowing again. It's such a magical moment.
Yep.
And Capra it's such an easy technique. It's just throw in the snow, but Capra captures it wonderfully.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot of like little things in this where, like with the pedals and you're like, oh, what's that going to do? Like, he was thinking ahead to what was going to happen. And I mean, this movie lost out to The Best Years of Our Lives for Best Picture. And I really enjoy The Best Years of Our Lives. But again, this goes back to the whole thing of like, it's funny to see what stands the test of time. And when it comes down to, at the end of the day, this is a plot heavy movie. I mean, this is very much, this is his life, whatever, but it's so character driven. Yes. It is so much about this guy and where he's from and what he's doing and all his dreams and his hopes and everything like that. And all the people around him and how they all interact with him and what he's doing. This is why a movie like this, to me, will always be better than a movie like Spotlight. Because this is the type of movie where you can connect with these people every single time. And no matter how old you are, how young you are, these are just themes that are just completely general to everybody. This is not something that you have to have lived a specific life. You could live in a city and people like Mr. Potter. And if you live in a small town, then everybody like everybody in this movie. It just works from top to bottom. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if a movie, a feel-good movie, I don't know if one will ever be made this good for as long as film goes on. I really don't know, because they always feel hokey. They always feel over the top. And this one doesn't feel those things. It doesn't feel like it's trying to force your emotions. It's just trying to tell you the story of this guy and how he lived his life.
Yeah, and it's like you're saying, like these feel good movies often have those grown moments in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, oh yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
This film doesn't have that.
Yeah.
This film, it just feels so genuine in everything. And I mean, I personally, I've seen the stage play of It's a Wonderful Life too, and like you capture the same feeling, and that's the power of this story, that it's played every year. There's no chance that I don't sit down and watch this again before December 25th.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
it's just that good of a movie that you can. It's probably one of my most viewed movies of all time,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm never going to grow tired of it.
Yeah. I mean, I totally hear you. I totally understand where you're coming from with that. I mean, it's something that every year you sit down, you watch it, and you enjoy it. And around this time of year, like we did this right after daylight savings. Do they do that in Canada?
Yes, they
Yes,
do.
it's so stupid. So we do this right after daylight savings, where all of a sudden it's 5:30 and it's pitch black out, and it just, it gets you, it puts you in that winter mood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, John. Well, that's It's a Wonderful Life. Let's talk about what we're gonna be doing next week, which we're gonna stay in the early 2010s. John's got Grand Budapest Hotel. Saoirse Ronan is going to be in that movie, So here we go. Saoirse Ronan, 2014. She's actually the star of the movie. I just cut it up and I just only watched the 5 minutes she's in. And The Impossible from 2012, the Naomi Watts movie. Two movies that are very different, but very stylized, two very good directors. And we're into our top 60. That's crazy.
Yeah.
These are number 60 coming up for each of us. Grand Budapest Hotel and The Impossible. And then John pretty much makes me, over the course of the next 8 weeks, talk about 5 movies that aren't even in my top 100, because he just selfishly put all his movies a little bit higher than mine.
It's okay. Eventually you have some that are higher than mine too.
Well, I know.
Way higher.
It's just funny how we go 5, and then like literally towards the end here, it's like John.
Yeah.
Like just you're making them up here. But yeah, so that's what we're gonna be doing next week. Very excited for that one. 2 very modern movies. After we've been kind of going back and forth here for the last bunch of weeks, where I don't think the last time we've had both movies be in the 2000s was actually all the way back with The Two Towers and Inside Llewyn Davis. And Inside Llewyn Davis is by no means like a new school movie. So I think this will be kind of fun, because since then it was like Moon and Y Tu Mama, but you didn't actually have Moon. You had Alien, Annie Hall, Empire, Jaws, Hereditary, Exorcist, Pulp Fiction. It takes a little while. And now here we are finally getting back into a one where we have just 2 2000s movies, 2000 teens movies. So I think this will be a good one. More modern ones, and ones that we find to be instant classics, considering neither one is even 10 years old yet. So that's it. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully I can get some movies in this week other than The Impossible and Grand Budapest Hotel. Go watch Dune if you haven't seen it. If you have, go watch French Dispatch. And if you don't like Wes Anderson, boy, are you making a mistake. But anyway, that's it. And we'll see you all next week.